guests on average staying in an Airbnb every night. So let's take a second and think about that complexity when it comes to money movement and thinking about moving that money between guests and hosts all around the world. I've oversimplified it greatly with this fun little diagram here, but a way to think about it is we have a host in Italy ready to rent his beautiful Italian villa, and we have guests coming from all over the world to stay with that host in Italy. They might be coming from, in this example, Brazil, coming from Korea, potentially coming from the UK. And when we think about this marketplace, all of these hosts are paying and buying, places to stay or experiences on Airbnb.com in their local payout methods or their local payment methods. Different currencies, credit cards, different types of payment methods. And this is, again, in over 200 countries around the world. So think about that complexity. Over 60 different currencies are supported on our platform. And that money all comes into Airbnb, who's facilitating the marketplace. And then once the guests go and enjoy their stay in the Italian countryside with our host in Italy, Airbnb then has to get that money to that host in a reliable and reliable fashion and make sure that happens at every transaction. If we think about this too, all of these transactions are small, right? You're booking a place to stay for a few days, maybe a month. And so there's hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of transactions every day. And when you take that into a year, that turns into like billions of transactions and billions of dollars that are moving around the world because of commerce that's happening on Airbnb. So this is not just complex from the actual process and the actual ecosystem, but let's throw all the compliance in the mix here. When you're talking about money, there's always regulations. We need to prevent money laundering. There's sanctions put in place by governments to restrict trade in certain countries. There's always different compliance regulation. We have legal entities in different countries around the world to help us facilitate our business there. With each country, with each legal entity, there's different regulations, there's different compliance reporting required, there's different ways in terms of how we treat money and where we can hold money and all of those types of things. There's regulations around knowing your customer to make sure that you're actually paying legitimate people and legitimate businesses through your platform. And then there's, of course, taxes. And when you put this into the mix, it gets even more complex. For me, though, this is what makes it exciting, because we look at this giant mess and we're like, how do we get $1 from our guest to our host in Italy, or however much money it is? And it starts to be really interesting and really fun in a really creative process as you navigate through all the complexity that's put in place by these regulations. In one specific scenario, we were presented with a problem in the tax regulation space in terms of how we handled VAT for our hosts. If you don't know what VAT is, it's basically a value-added tax. It's kind of like sales tax in the United States. It impacts most hosts in Europe and also in other regions of the world where this VAT value-added tax is applied. Now, who here gets excited about taxes? Is anyone a tax lawyer or a tax accountant? As a product manager, you're probably not like, yay, we get to deal with taxes today. But after we uncover all the complexity, there's actually a lot of opportunity for our hosts and for our business tangled up in this regulation. Actually, it wasn't just one regulation, there's multiple regulations that were impacted here. So with this specific effort and this specific opportunity we pursued, by deeply understanding these regulations and by working very, very closely with our tax lawyers and tax specialists, both internal and external, and thoroughly thinking through all of our options in terms of a path forward, we were able to come up with something that felt impossible. It was a win for our hosts, it was a win for Airbnb, and it was a win because it met regulatory standards. In most cases, there's a trade-off or a compromise that has to be made. And what we're going to talk about today is how you move beyond those and how you find that situation that is a win-win-win for not upsetting your regulators, not creating issues, where you're going to get lawsuits or problems from your regulators, but still creating a win for both your company and for your customers. So this wasn't easy. This project wasn't easy to do. It meant long hours of me as a product manager diving into tax codes, understanding what we were dealing with, tons of conversations and back and forths with our lawyers, both internal and external, and at times struggles to put together the right message to get buy-in from all of our business leaders and from all the right people, because every time you hear taxes, people just start closing their ears at times because it's like, oh no, here we go again. But we're trying to express what the opportunity was and also simplify what it was that we were going to do in a way that everyone could understand without being experts. And that comes with a lot of complexity. And you might have found yourself in similar situations. If you work in financial services, similar to me, or insurance, if you work in healthcare, you probably have similar circumstances where you have regulators that you can't upset. If you upset the regulators, it brings all types of problems into your world. Same thing, a lot of times you have intense oversight, you have audits that you have to comply with, but there's still a lot of problems to solve. There's still a lot of things that your customers want to do in an easy way without a lot of friction. And a lot of times, regulations aren't well designed for digital products. They're slow to evolve. The rules are at times still being written. And there may even be limitations to what you can do in your product development process. You might not be able to A/B test. If you're touching somebody's money, it can't be like, surprise, we broke this half and it didn't quite work and the money didn't show up in your account. Or healthcare, like, surprise, we accidentally did something that released your medical records, to the public. You might be really limited in terms of some of the things that you might be able to do from, what we hear as typical product development processes. I like to sum that up with, we often hear around Silicon Valley the phrase, move fast and break things. When we're talking about regulatory products, that's not really something you can do. Think about it maybe as move carefully and don't kill people or upset your regulators. Doesn't mean that you can't be innovative though. And why it's important to think about this is you still need to find ways to grow. Reframing how you work with regulations is really important, because if you don't continue to find ways to innovate and to stay relevant for your customers and push through when you feel stuck and overwhelmed by these regulations, the competitiveness of your product slowly erodes. And why that's bad is other companies may come in and take your market share. If we think about financial services, we see this happening with PayPal. Once upon a time, PayPal was revolutionary. They were the innovative company that was disrupting payments. When I say PayPal today, do you think about them in that same way? No, when we hear innovative disrupting payments, we think about Stripe, we think about Chime, we think about other companies that are innovating and disrupting the financial services space. And so reframing how you think about regulations is really important to you, because it helps you to then stay at the top of that innovation curve so that you keep your market share, you keep your customers, and continue growing, as opposed to fading into the background and losing relevancy. As James mentioned, as we've talked about, this is kind of an area that I really like working in. It gives you some of the ideas of things I've done throughout my career. And why? Because again, it makes that problem solving and identifying those opportunities that much harder, but in my opinion, that much more fun, because that complexity really forces you to get creative. It really forces you to learn and go really deep on things. And that has been really, really interesting to me throughout my career. So what did I do, or what do I recommend doing to stay on top of your regulations and to stay innovative in those environments? One of the first key things is to just scan the regulatory environment regularly. What does that mean? We want to look to understand how regulations are changing, either positively or negatively for your product. And you want to connect those regulatory changes back to customer value. If it's changing in a certain way, does this open opportunities for you? Does it potentially close other opportunities? And understand how that regulatory change fits into your strategy. Is there something that relates to our product strategy here that we should take advantage of, that we can go deeper on, or that we should be a first mover on? And I would say build these regulatory check-ins into your process for collecting insights. We're often looking at our customers, we're looking at our metrics, we're looking at our data, we're looking at impact or feedback that comes from our customers, from customer service tickets and things like that. We're doing research with our customers, all of that. Encourage you to build this in as another source of insights in terms of how you think about your product strategy and how you think about your opportunities that you're going to pursue. And that those changes in the regulatory landscape can sometimes be really big opportunities. An example of that in my career was when I was at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. After the 2008 financial crisis, there were tons of new regulations put on the market. And what happened in 2008 was when the subprime mortgage products all blew up and the market crashed. And because of that, there was a lot more oversight and a lot more regulations put on market trading and on the types of financial products that can be offered on an exchange. The CFTC was introduced, a brand new regulatory body, yay, and tons of new laws that needed to be in compliance with. And at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, they decided to see this as an opportunity, as opposed to being overwhelmed by all these new regulations, because throughout its history, Chicago Mercantile Exchange was an expert in regulatory compliance. They decided to use that as a competitive advantage. And that led to building a brand new business line called trade repository services, where the Mercantile Exchange essentially took that complexity away from both existing customers and used it as a business line to gain new customers that weren't necessarily trading on the Mercantile Exchange. And what they did was simplify all the reporting that they needed to do for swaps, which are very, very complex derivative products, and leverage that expertise and leverage those changes in the regulations to then create a new business line, which has since grown and expanded to other markets besides the US, and also got a lot of new clients and a lot of new customers to be clients of the Mercantile Exchange and other services from the Mercantile Exchange, because they engaged with this new trade repository service business line first. So it ended up turning into a really big opportunity for the Mercantile Exchange because of those regulatory changes and because they were ahead of the game and addressing and figuring out ways to add customer value through that regulatory environment. So if you don't stay in sync with the regulations, this is one of the areas where you start falling behind, because your strategy just doesn't fit into the environment anymore. Or you miss a big thing that could actually help you move your strategy forward that other people playing in your space do, and you don't, and you start falling behind. And so that's why it's really critical to scan and stay in sync with that regulatory environment, so that you do stay competitive and you do stay at the top of your game, and you are looking ahead to see those areas and those crevices that you can potentially go in and potentially even influence the regulations to work more in your favor. The other thing that really made a difference in all the things that I've worked on that were really, really heavily regulated or had a lot of constraints was really deep collaboration. What do I mean by this? As product people, we're generally accustomed to, yes, product design and engineering needs to work really, really closely together. But when we're talking about these landscapes, I encourage you to expand that list of people who needs to work really closely together to include your legal teams, your compliance teams, your customer facing teams, if it's like working with certain customer sets. If you're in healthcare, potentially working really closely with your doctors or with other people that really understand the industry and really understand the regulations. And what I mean by this is, reframe how you're actually thinking about the collaboration. You should start this whole initiative together. They should be involved in the scans of the regulatory environment with you. And you want to do that versus asking later, right? It's not where we're just pulling in the lawyer to do a final review or a sign off. We're actually co-designing it from the beginning. We're not just gathering requirements. We're not just putting things into a list of what we can and cannot do, but we're really, really partnering close together. And in order to do that, you need time, space, and curiosity. This is where I was talking about, me diving into the VAT tax codes, all of that type of stuff was required for me to really understand what it is that we were dealing with and be able to help come up with creative ways for us to be able to address that and find that win-win-win situation. And I have this funny little image here because you can see we spent so much time with our tax specialists that we ended up giving them a superhero character, the VAT man, instead of Batman, if you didn't get it. Because we were spending hours together, and at times it just went into delusion of like craziness and like all the different tax terms and whatnot. But it was through that close collaboration that we were able to understand the nuances. And what I would say is, if you don't collaborate closely together with these stakeholders and with these subject matter experts, you miss those nuances. And it's in those details that you find breakthroughs. And so it's really, really deeply understanding that in this case and how it was treated and what the regulations were, that we found the ability for us to have a breakthrough that was win-win-win across the board. If we had just taken it at the surface level, we would have missed that. And we actually almost went in the wrong direction. There was a point in time where we had like a some very heated discussions because we were like, well, let's just do this. Let's just get it over with and do this. And it was like, we had to dive deeper and really have those conversations to then really understand the nuances and come up with what we ended up coming up with. And that leads to the third technique, or the third principle that I think about. And I'm coining this phrase from somebody. They called it kaleidoscope thinking, and it's kind of stuck with me. I read it in an article years ago. And I think this describes the type of thinking that you need to do in these situations really well. So what do I mean by this? When we're thinking about kaleidoscope thinking, you've heard me mention to this point where you need to have a really deep understanding of the constraint or the regulation. The more familiar you are with it and the more time you have to sit with it, the more ideas come up that are expected. And you don't want to get stuck thinking about what you can't do, but you want to focus on what you can do, and potentially in a creative way. And I like to think about this as like, give your brain a tough problem, seep it with all the information that it needs, and let it manifest a solution. That's what our human brains are really good at. Why you always have great ideas when you're in the shower or on a walk or cooking or doing whatever it is that's not necessarily thinking about something. It's sitting in the back of your brain thinking. And the more you can do that, again, in a collaborative environment with all the information that you have about the regulation and let it kind of simmer in your brain, that's where the ideas and the breakthroughs come from. And sometimes it may be when you're not focusing on it. And that's also where the importance of having time and space comes in. And what I mean by kaleidoscope, if you guys all remember, this was actually one of my favorite toys when I was little, which probably explains why it stuck with me when I read it in the article. But if you remember kaleidoscopes, there were these little things and they had the crystals in them, and you just slowly turn them. It was the same sets of crystals, but as you turned it, all of a sudden, the images that you saw were very, very different. And when I think about this type of thinking, it's the same thing. The pieces are all there. You have the regulations, you have your constraints, you have all of that. But if you slowly start shifting those pieces around, all of a sudden you get different ideas, you get different ways of looking at things, and that's where the breakthroughs come. Why? Because the first idea is never the only idea. There is never only one idea, and it's hardly ever the best idea. And it's through coming up with new ideas, looking at things through different angles, that you start getting those original and those really flexible ideas. And those are the ones that can be turned into competitive advantages. But it takes a lot of different angles and a lot of different ideas to actually get to that point. And so doing this kaleidoscope thinking, again, helps you not just come up with one idea and potentially move in that direction blindsided and not seeing the rest of the environment. Using this type of thinking helps you look at it from a whole bunch of different angles and get to that really original, really unique idea that you may not have thought of otherwise. But it's always, after you get some of those initial ideas out of the way, that those more original, more flexible, more unique ideas come through. And so embracing this concept of kaleidoscope thinking helps you get to those unique ideas that you can potentially turn into a competitive advantage. So as all you joined this event today, you probably had something in your mind in terms of regulations or constraints that you're dealing with. And let's be honest, constraints are at the heart of product. All of your stakeholders represent some type of constraint, even if it's not a regulatory constraint. Marketing can't do this. You always have budget constraints. There's all different types of things that you're having to operate within. And so I would look at it this way, in terms of thinking about being worried about how many constraints you have, it's what you do with those constraints that count. So you can get stuck, you can consider them boundaries, and you can be limited by them. Or you can get creative. You can pull in your subject matter experts and you can look at the constraints from different angles. You can learn and you can stick with it until you find a breakthrough. So I would ask, next time you find yourself up against something that you can't do because of a regulation, think about how you could analyze that regulation and the history of that regulation, how it came to be that way, where it's potentially going in the future. Think about who your subject matter experts are. Who is your Batman that's going to come in and save the day? And think about how you can break open that idea generator, how you can shift those pieces around and see what you can come up with. And by doing that, you'll be able to push through and find something that's going to add a lot of value to your customers and grow your business. And with that, we will switch over to Q&A. And if anyone wants to keep in touch, also have my information here. But would love to hear folks' questions about regulations, or if you have questions about things that you're facing specifically, or any of the ideas that I have in terms of things that have worked for me in the past. Would love to hear them.
I have a question.
Sure. Was that Elizabeth?
Yes. So I have a question around COVID restrictions and your host, and how Airbnb is kind of working with them on that.
What was it? Your internet broke up a little bit. What type of restrictions?
The COVID restrictions, and with the specifically to the host, and like
Yes.
assuming liability or something like around those lines. So I work on a platform called Practice Hero, and we have a similar model where we have a facility, and a lot of the concerns they have right now is assuming the COVID liability.
Yeah, so I can't speak to like the legal side of COVID too much, as my focus is mainly in payments. But you can see like some of the things that we've done is, brought in a lot of experts on COVID. So it's a similar thing, like the subject matter experts, where we've consulted with different doctors and different kind of health bodies around the world to come up with the cleaning protocols and all of the guidance that we are giving to our hosts. And also thinking about, things in terms of how we change the platform, where, there's potentially more time in between stays, where, we're giving that guidance and potentially even giving support to hosts in terms of how to do those cleaning protocols, and like what to use and all of that type of stuff, so that it breaks it down and makes it a little bit more, I don't know what the word is, like digestible, I guess, so that they can understand how to still be safe and operate in these environments. And then, on top of it, there's also just certain market restrictions where, at times markets are closed, where, you can't do short-term rentals, or they have to be over 30 days and things like that. And so there's a lot too to just helping all the individual hosts understand the specifics of their market and what can and cannot happen, and then setting them up to be as successful as they can to make sure that, we're not, we're being as safe as we possibly can with COVID, and understanding that people are sharing spaces, which, is a tough thing in this time when you have to do all the social distancing measures and things like that.
Thank you.
I don't know if there's live questions, or I can also scan through the chat. I think there were some questions in there as they were coming up as we were talking.
Yeah, and feel free, for anyone, come on live and ask any questions based upon, if there's a certain regulation or constraint that you want to kind of share, feel free to share it, and it'd be great, Colleen, for you to, share your wisdom.
Hey, Colleen, I have a question.
Go for it, Nelson.
So for what I'm doing, the Port of San Francisco has a resource that I desperately need. And in fact, this resource has been an incredible white elephant that's been idle for a decade or more. But it's like this huge bureaucracy, and I can't know how to chip away at it. It's like, why not let me use it? If I provide insurance and a fee and, a waiver, why not? It's been a nightmare.
That's interesting.
How do I get around a bureaucracy is basically what I'm getting at.
Yes, bureaucracies are oftentimes, it goes back, I think a lot of times you get really vague answers, right? Like insurance industry is probably a big one with this, where it's like, we're going to, jam it full with legal terminology, so you can't really understand what I'm saying anyway. It also kind of reminds me of negotiating with my landlord recently, because they don't seem to be motivated by wanting to rent a unit and prefer to leave it empty. But, this kind of goes back, I would lean back on this, the kaleidoscope thinking a little bit with this, is really trying to figure out what their motivations are in terms of what the core is that they're trying to achieve through the bureaucracy, right? Is it like, are they trying to protect a certain group of people? Are they trying to protect themselves from liability? What is it that's at the core of what they're trying to do? And the more you can understand that, the more you can potentially craft something that's appealing. And then it goes back to also subject matter experts on helping you dig through that bureaucracy. Like, I couldn't be digging through the tax codes on my own. We leveraged so much time with lawyers to really understand the nuances of it. And at certain points, we actually put cases in front of legal bodies to see if they were defensible. And so I would say like trying to prototype as much as you can in terms of how you might be able to remove the bureaucracy or come up with a case that kind of pushes through it. But prototyping it in a safe way so that you're not doing it, going in like guns blazing, like we're going to just do this and don't care. That is a strategy as well, but that has a lot of ramifications. I think that was kind of the strategy like Uber took with some of the things that they were facing with the regulatory environment, and it's had some backlash for sure. And so that's like that balance of where you're still being aggressive, but in a way that's not rumbling too many feathers, I guess. And the more you can learn as you're going along the way, then that kind of helps you strengthen your case or strengthen your approach. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I'm really curious what this resource is that they're not,
It's
that
a
you really
cargo
want and
crane.
they won't give you.
It's a cargo crane.
Yeah.
The
Does that help? Any insights in terms of like how you might be able to break through?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to a supervisor now, so I have an appointment with a supervisor of that district to talk about it. So that's where I'm going now.
And that part of it is also like finding it's like a hunt and search type thing, right? Of like finding who those people are that potentially know, or like can have some movement. And that's a piece of, as you're scanning that environment, it's like where you can have influence. Another thing, like Airbnb Experiences worked to actually influence a lot of the regulations around food preparation in homes, where Airbnb helped work with the regulators to actually find something that really worked with what we were doing with experiences, where people were doing cooking classes or things like that in really small environments and potentially in their homes, and worked in California to actually get regulations that helped support what we were doing in a safe way. And it's through that collaboration and taking a collaborative approach, I think that you really get to a place that's the regulators feel comfortable and feel like their interests are protected. Same thing with like whatever there's a bureaucratic process around, but you're able to actually do something then that's also meeting your interests and your customers' interests.
Hey, so speaking of Airbnb, has there been any instances where someone rented the house and there was some illegal activity gone, and then they came back to sue Airbnb about it?
Those can't speak to specifically. It's also not my area, but there are, there's always risk when you're having people share spaces, right? Strangers sharing spaces. Luckily, majority of the cases are great, but that we have like a whole resolution process around that. And that's where the host guarantee comes in, where we have, and also the guest guarantee, where we have things in place and processes in place to kind of deal with those situations as they evolve. And, there are some cases where, Airbnb is also helping to protect the hosts.
Well, there was that Halloween thing, guys, where you guys were renting to a short-term Halloween thing. That was part of that, right? Or resolution.
Yeah, and if you look in our newsroom, there's a lot of articles about things that we were doing where in some cases Airbnb is also taking legal action against people who are offending the policies, and in cases like that, also trying to look for areas where there's a high risk of problems and trying to prevent those. So there's a lot of work that we're doing to help build that trust across our community of hosts and guests.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nelson. So Colleen, we did have a number more questions, and so I'll just kind of moderate them. And
awesome.
Then, I know there's, let me first start with Vicky, because I know her sound's not working, at least I don't think so. I'll just go ahead and read it out here. You can, do you spend time in finding sort of ready-made technologies of which helped you to manage either tax regulation requirements and/or compliance regulations, or do you primarily do custom software integrations and solutions? Any thoughts?
Yes, that's a big, it depends. Part of our product process is always looking for build, buy, partner. We want to only build the things that are really our competitive advantage in terms of things that have to be different. Wherever we can buy and partner, we do as much as we can. Like when we talk about moving money all around the world, we have a whole network of gateways and processors that work with us, and banks and acquirers and all that type of stuff. So, we're not building it all from scratch, and we aren't a bank, right? So that is our first principle is wherever we can, if it's not our competitive advantage, let's find somebody who we can partner with or who we can buy it from. But there are some intricacies in terms of our business model where we are different, and that leads to where we have to either build something or build something on top, where it's like a partnership type model. You know, especially in taxes, there's a lot of stuff in terms of like our financial systems. We are able to leverage a lot of bot solutions in terms of how we actually do the tracking of revenue and the accounting and stuff like that. But when we get into some of the nuances, there's a lot of things where we have to look at how we hold money in different entities, and you know, how we have to really configure that and think about how we track the money movement, and also how we look at it from an internal perspective of just making sure the money is landing in everybody's hands how we expect it to. And so there are some things there that we have built internally that really help us with that money movement, and that level of detail that we're looking for some of the programs and things that we run internally as well.
Great, thanks for sharing that. And then I'll move on to the next question. And then Vicky, if you have any clarifications, you know, just go ahead and share those into the chat. So I'll turn it over to Seamus. You want to come off mute?
Colleen. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. Question around when regulations encapsulate cultural differences as well. So you are kind of an intermediary between not only communities and individuals, but also very distinct cultures. So I presume that you have to create a product which faces one population, which encapsulates and interprets cultural regulatory requirements from another. When you do that, how do you navigate that complexity without defaulting to a process of education when you have to educate a customer, you've lost already?
Yeah, you know, some of it is, I think what you're referring to is it's like things also, you know, there's like certain people from certain countries can't travel to other countries without visas or restrictions, or like where you can stay and like those types of things. Is that what you're talking about mostly?
It can take so many different forms, but sure, that's definitely part of it. Sure.
Yeah, and I think, you know, some of it is the more, like you were saying, like it shouldn't feel burdensome to the guest or the host. The more you can kind of obfuscate that complexity, the better. And, you know, some of it is like the certain options that aren't available just shouldn't come up in that person's search, right? So it's like just being able to like understand and comply. And, you know, there's a lot of things where like business travelers in certain countries have to have certain permissions to be able to stay, and or like provide certain levels of information and stuff like that to the host. Or, you know, there's tourist taxes and different things that happen, and it's unfortunately different in almost every country, and sometimes even in every city. And, you know, there's whole teams within our organization that deal with that. We have like teams around like cities and all of the like occupancy taxes and like all those types of treatments, and just like the regulations on who can stay and what information the host needs to have, et cetera, that's working on helping to build that into the product. And similarly, also like on the side of making sure the hosts are set up for success, so that they're doing the right things in their cities or in their countries that they're required to do in order to be like on the platform and have short-term rentals. This is where it gets super complex, and it's slightly different. Like I'm focused on money movement, but again, it's those similar concepts apply across all those things about looking at all the individual cities and countries and their specific regulations on short-term rentals and on the travel industry or tourism industry as well, and how to think about how we put that into the product and make it seamless and frictionless as much as possible, because otherwise it's a point of frustration, and it's most of the times a point of confusion. And what ends up happening is the host and the guest messaging each other and getting really confused. And then it feels like, you know, like this host doesn't want me to stay or whatever it is. But it's like the more we can equip them to also just better explain, you know, what needs to be done to somebody who may not understand or have ever dealt with it before, then those are the types of things that we can help facilitate those relationships and help make them more seamless with our product and with the support that we give to both sides of the community. Does that answer, or any follow-up questions?
That definitely entertains it for a bit. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it's complex. You've got to have teams dedicated to individual organizations, different geographies and cultures. If that's the case, and so you've got the teams dedicated within the organization. Chances are you have ideally selected those teams from the cultures that they are intended to represent and interpret. Then you've kind of like internalized that the need to integrate those elements of Kaleidoscope as well.
Yeah, I think
so
another way is also
you're kind
like
of duplicating
sorry.
that complexity. You're kind of duplicating that complexity inside the organization now. And so now you can have within a smaller area, you can start to establish those cultural connections maybe.
Yeah, I would say like it's a little bit different where it's teams that are kind of experts in these areas, and through intense research they can understand the different circumstances, but think about as they've built up their expertise in the different types of techniques you might use, of how you can apply those across different circumstances so that there's still some consistency across it, right? Because like you're saying, we don't want to make it more complex, and I think mirroring the complexity, it kind of goes to that like siloed approach where what we're really focusing on is building that expertise and finding elegant ways to deal with it, and looking through the complexity of the problem. A lot of it's just really deep research, right? So like those people are becoming experts on whatever specific situation is that they're building for at the time, but leveraging the expertise in their history from having done that in other circumstances to then think about what the most elegant solutions could be.
Yeah,
We do, tons of customer research, and that's like a lot of it's to get really deep into really understanding the nuances of some of those things. A big area that we were working on, we did a release recently on Project Lighthouse, which is a lot about really understanding and preventing discrimination on our platform, which is really tough. And it's a really complex problem, but there's a lot of white papers now out about that in terms of our approach. And it was a similar thing there of like people becoming experts on it and understanding the different forms of it and coming up with elegant ways for us to help make sure that's not something that's wherever we can, where we can prevent that on our platform.
Great.
I jump in.
Thanks. Yeah, I did have another speaker that I needed to tee up next, unless it's related to the last one.
Well, it is actually. It's related to all of it in terms of kaleidoscope thinking. I've dealt with a lot of regulatory issues, and what I've found is, let's call it kaleidoscope action, which is what I found is if you don't ask the right question, you won't get the right answer. So what has worked for me is I keep asking the question from different angles until I exhaust all the questions. And I can't tell you how many times that has worked for us, where the person who's trying to apply the regulation loses sight of the intent of the regulation. So they're interpreting it the way they believe it should be applied. And if you just continually keep asking the question and you keep putting it in a different way, sometimes you get success. And I think Colleen's probably experienced this before.
Yes, 100% echo that. And that, I think how you described, that constantly re-asking the question is exactly the crux of the kaleidoscope thinking, where it's like, you're asking the question and just shifting things potentially a little bit each time. And it's only through that and the persistence where you actually then start finding those hidden truths, or those, like you were saying, the really understanding the core of why the regulation exists and all of that, which gives you, it kind of arms you with the information that you need to be able to then integrate that into the solutions or the ideas that you're pursuing. And without doing that, then you're operating blind in a lot of senses. And it's just doubly important here because of the complexity, where you really have to constantly do that frame and reframe and just looking at all the options and shifting things around a little bit. So completely echo that.
Great, thanks for the question, Hayden. So Colleen, we've got about 3 or 4 more in the queue, so I want to make sure we get these. I'm going to tee up Amit, if you want to go ahead and share your question.
Yes, hi. So my question is regarding the 401ks. I was employed at an employer who didn't have 401k. I was there for a long time, and now I am at a place where I do have it. And so I'm like, all these years, I was without a 401k, and why should that be? So I would like to change this, and but IRS seems like a Goliath, and any thoughts or suggestions on how I should go about doing it?
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. It sounds like a great idea for a startup. I do think there's a few companies that are playing in the space a little bit, but it goes back to, just asking those questions, kind of like Hayden was suggesting, of why is that the case? Why does the 401k have to be sponsored by an employer? Why can't it be an individual investment product? And I think you just start with some small questions and start learning. And that's where you maybe start seeing some opportunities. Agree with you totally, for especially people who are like self-employed and the rise of the gig economy and stuff like that, they're not going to get 401ks. So how can they make investments that are smart for their future? I think it's just kind of understanding what people are trying to do and why those restrictions are in place today, of like why those can only be sponsored by employers, and then digging into that and figuring out if there's a way where it doesn't have to be. And it might take a while. I mean, that's the part where it's like, I always say, for me, these regulations, the interesting part is the complexity. Like, am I ever going to be a tax attorney or a tax product person? No, but that project was really fun. Because you're able to kind of dive into something and really learn it. And that's something that I really like doing. But for other people, if you're going to start a company, you really want to probably really enjoy that industry that you're breaking into. And so I'd say for like the 401k, it's like loving kind of investment products and stuff like that encourages you to keep going, even if it might take a year or two to really investigate it.
But let's say if I am able to have this regulation changed, there's like already companies that provide 401k. So for somebody who already has that infrastructure, it's a boon. So like, should I just do this as like a goodwill gesture, or like your first thought was, okay, that's a great startup idea, but how can it be a startup if other people can just use the change in the regulation very easily?
Yeah, and I would investigate if it's really a regulation change that needs to happen. But there's a lot of companies that are just doing the same thing but better. And so there are very few ideas that haven't been done before. It's just a lot of companies are doing the same thing but better. And if you're really going to pursue it, I think it's just thinking through also the business model and how you build like your competitive advantage to differentiate you. And why your customers would stay with you, even if their employer offered some option in the future. That's almost a whole business case or business study of diving into a new product idea. But hopefully that gets you started.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Amit, thanks for asking the question. So let me turn it over to Farah. I don't know if you want to actually ask the question or if you want me to go ahead and read it. Let me go ahead and read it. I don't know. So here's the question, Colleen. In organizations where close collaboration in a cross-functional way with subject matter experts is not currently possible, whether it's cost, limited time, et cetera, what would you recommend?
So my first question would be, why isn't it possible? And unpack that, because if it's not possible, then that starts to tell me that it's not a priority. And if it's not a priority, then why are we working on it? And then we start going down the rabbit hole of whys. If it's not possible because of cultural reasons, cost, if it's all people's jobs to be working on this, I would want to better understand like what some of those constraints are. Most of the time I see it as it's like a cultural challenge. Like for us to pull lawyers into a product development process, lawyers don't do product development. That's not what they're comfortable with. That's not like really where they're focused at times. And so it comes from like better understanding the other side of like just internally as well. Like, what are people's expertise? How do they work? How to best explain an idea, how to pull them in. And a lot of times that's challenging, right? And that's why I mentioned in our project with that, we had a lot of heated conversations where we were just kind of annoyed with each other in terms of, they would probably say that I was trying to move too fast. And I would say that, sometimes the legal mumbo jumbo is a little bit too much. It was just like, let's just get to a yes or no. I'm tired of hearing maybes. But it was built on like a foundation of respect and just us, having a common goal in terms of resolving the problem. And so we were able to work through just like some of the differences in terms of ways of working and our approaches and things like that. And get to an area where we were really able to collaborate closely. And so I would just, ask that question of like, why are we considering it not possible? and figuring out ways to break down those barriers and those silos.
Great. And
hopefully that answers, yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of typed into private here, Farah, if you've got any kind of clarifying questions, feel free to go ahead and share them, and then we can certainly come back to them. Let me tee up Prashant, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. Welcome.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Thank you so much. And thanks, Colleen, for the great presentation. So I'm a product manager at Turo, which is a peer-to-peer car sharing marketplace. And similar to Airbnb, we have this sort of problem of, kind of annoying the big traditional players in the space. So every time we try to do something, enterprise hurts, all these companies try to sue us. And then, on a state-by-state level in the US and even internationally, we oftentimes have challenges with new regulation that's being lobbied by the sort of big rental car industry. So, one thing that I've found throughout my couple of years here is this balance between building reactively in order to solve compliance needs, or also thinking about maybe preemptively doing certain situations. How does Airbnb kind of balance that? Do you, for instance, let's say there's a new pricing transparency compliance or something in a certain province or state or country, and like, do you sort of do it first in that state and then do you like test it in other markets? Or I was just curious about how the sort of product development mindset was in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we do face this all the time as well. Like, as much as you try to stay on top of the regulatory landscape, things change and you may be caught off guard and, be put in reactive mode, or it's just like, you have to pick and choose what you focus on. So I think it's like what you said is exactly the approach I'd recommend, where it's like, you try to start small and test, which may look different because of the regulations or the constraints, right? Like when you're talking about pricing or things where it's like, if you're found out that you're doing it differently in different markets, that could create its own bag of worms. And so, in some cases, some of the things that we do to kind of prototype and test it are completely behind the scenes, where we take prototypes and put it in front of the regulators and say, does this meet the requirement? And do it in a very collaborative way of like, we're seeking to understand, we understand why you need to do this. This is how we've interpreted it. Does this look like it meet, so that we're getting initial feedback, even if it's not official. Ideally, it would be official, right? Where they're like, yes, we give the stamp of approval. So then when it's out in the open and people can test it, then it's like, well, the regulators kind of already brought along with the process. And that's like, a lot of it's this, at the mercantile exchange, especially, you could look at the regulators in two ways. One is the bad guy, right? When they come in for the audit, we would have a monthly audit and it's like, everyone hides, right? And the regulators are here and it's like, a big deal and where you change how you're working. Or what I would suggest is the approach is where you look at them as a partner, right? They're just trying to do their jobs as well. And there's a reason for those things and those organizations to exist. And the more you can come across as a collaborative partner and show how your business and what you're doing is actually helping the people that they are protecting or caring about with the terms of their regulations, and how you're doing things in an ethically safe and compliant way, the more you can demonstrate that and the more you can bring them in and have them be partners, I think the better off you are. That's from what I've seen, and there's, again, kind of different approaches there. I think you do have to take a tough position at times, and it could be, it's not just a lovey-dovey, like everything's fine relationship. Like sometimes there's like back and forth, and there's sometimes legal things that have to happen, but where you take a tough position, but it's through that you kind of push through and actually understand what your options are. And you just need to do it, I think, with the end goal of it being a collaborative relationship overall. And it's only devolving into like a us versus them legal lawsuits all over the place if it has to go that route. And if it does, then I think it's worth to also reflecting on why that happened and why we weren't able to get to something that was working earlier. And that's not always the case with competitors, but like when you're looking at the regulatory bodies that are going to be making the decisions about the regulation and those types of situations, that's where you can get the guidance that you kind of know what you're getting into beforehand, before you get too far down the path. Hopefully that helps. Does that help answer like kind of the approach or like how we think about it or how I think about it?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I think we're kind of aligned on that. I think it's you're not going to do yourself any favors sort of angering people, right? It's all about sort of finding that middle ground compromise. I think
Yeah.
the challenge from a product perspective, it always feels like to me, is whenever you're reacting, you're oftentimes building unscalable things, and those unscalable things eventually end up having to scale because everyone else sues you around it. And then you're like, why didn't we just build a scalable thing in the first place? But then it's hard to make that argument versus something that'll make money in the short term or increase engagement in the short term. So I think it's a classic sort of too many like shiny things, too little resources type of project, and sort of, you know, prioritization problem.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I think that's like, it goes back to just product development, right? You always have to ask, I think first is like, how do you solve the problem? And then second, how do you actually do it in a scalable way? And it only becomes that more important with these types of things, because when it's not scalable and when the regulators come back and look a second time and there's problems, then you start getting into even more trouble.
Great. I know we have only just a couple minutes left. Siemens, did you have another question that you wanted to share with Colleen?
Yeah, it was around the notice and comment process. So frequently in the United States, you've got the opportunity when regulations are shifted or introduced, you've got the opportunity to notice and comment. So number one, does Airbnb participate in that process? And number two, if you do you find that representing Airbnb, do you find that you're listened to more or less?
That's a great question. So mostly the teams that handle that are our legal teams. I can speak specifically to some of the areas where we're working with like financial regulations. Like a big thing that we're working on right now is SCA compliance, secure customer authentication, I think is what it stands for. It's actually a European regulation. And, you know, we are very involved in that process. And similarly at the Mercantile Exchange, we were very involved in some of the compliance around, I'm actually losing the acronym for the regulation, but it was a lot of how like energy products were traded. And they were putting a lot new regulatory guidance around that as well. But I think it's important, you know, this is where like having really strong legal teams is, and like really strong kind of business development teams are really important, because they get involved in those types of conversations with the regulatory bodies. And a lot of times the regulatory bodies really do want the consultation and advice from real business people to actually understand like how it will be applied and whether or not it's clear. Because if it's not, you know, it creates a headache for everybody. So I do think, you know, there's a lot of times where you're invited to the table. And one of my old teammates and experiences, she had been with the company for like 8+ years. And, you know, she was like, it was a great thing throughout her career to see her getting invited to the table more and more to talk about like tourism rules and restrictions and guidance and stuff like that, where, you know, as the company grew, it was like a bigger player in the space. And so it was like, you know, I think a lot of that's just, you know, who the regulators know about, who they consult, and they're looking across like the size of the market and, you know, who's kind of doing what in the market, and inviting those people into the conversation. But I do think it's really influential. And the more you can kind of get at the table, the more opportunity you have to helpfully sway the regulations potentially in your favor, in a way that still kind of stays true to the heart of like what the regulation was about. That's definitely been something that Airbnb has been working on, like from legal side of like partnering with cities. And, you know, the things that we released recently where we have like the city portal and things like that, where we're building tools even to help the regulators to better understand how to regulate short-term rentals in their markets. And that, I think, furthers that relationship, where then you continue to get invited into the conversation.
Great. Well, Seamus, thanks for sharing that. And we just got 2 minutes left. And if anybody who's joining us with us today wants to do a shout out, again, it could be anything that you want to share with folks who are still left on the call, feel free to come off mute and share it. All right. Well, I don't hear anything, but feel free to share something in the chat if you want. We're going to keep the event open for 15 minutes more for anybody who wants to kind of hang out for another 15 minutes to get to know each other and chit chat a little bit more. I just wanted to say thank you all for really joining, and thank you, Colleen, for being a part and sharing everything there is to know about regulations and influencing product design and so forth. Thank you for making time for that. It was great to have you. And again, thanks for a lot of you who were joining today, being your first time. And I hope that you'll join us next month, or actually our next event will actually be in January.
Thanks for having me. And thank you, everybody. If you do have more questions or thinking about it, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to keep the conversation going. So appreciate everyone's participation and great questions. It's always interesting to hear other people's perspectives and thoughts on this too. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Colleen.